It's no secret that the average new car in America has become pretty darn expensive. And every time we review one of those supposedly mainstream vehicles, the comment section is flooded by people saying, who can afford these vehicles? Where is my affordable transportation? Well, here it is, guys. This is a Buick Envista. And even for 2025, including destination, this could be under $24,000. Now today we're taking a look at the most expensive version, which is just barely over 30 grand. So let's talk about why you might want to put your money where your mouth is and buy a Buick. Now first things first, I have to admit that as a child of the 70s, my impression of Buick involves blue hair and, a walker. But that's not where Buick is today. Buick is definitely going in a different direction, and I applaud them for that. Buick's mission is to try and be a premium mainstream brand. So think not quite Acura, but maybe something along the lines of where Mazda wants to be. And that means that even though this is a little bit more expensive than its close relative, the Chevy Trax, we get a more premium and more elegant feel, even though the parts are really quite similar. That means that logically the main reason to get the Envista over the Chevy Trax is style. Do you want something that looks a little bit more elegant, a little bit more sedan-like, or do you prefer more of a crossover styled hatch? The Buick look, I think, works really well on a vehicle this size. It looks a bit more attractive to my eye than the upcoming Buick Enclave, which wears this exact same design language, only scaled up by about 300%. The front end changes a little bit based on the version you're looking at. The base version has more of a horizontal theme to the grille. The ST and this top end Avenir trim get more of an egg crate style grille, but the headlights and the accent lights remain the same. These are the DRLs and they're the turn signals. The headlights are a little bit lower, and no trim gets LED fog lights. The most interesting thing about the Buick Envista, and actually the Chevy Trax for that matter, is that the base trims don't really feel like penalty boxes. Even though you don't get all the same standard feature content we get on this model, there is a ton of stuff both inside and outside standard. The Envista is a good example of my personal theory that the sedan isn't really dying in North America, it's simply growing up and adapting to the 21st century. They're calling this sort of a coupe crossover, much like we see exploding in the luxury segment, but when you look close at the details, it's essentially a sedan. We get a relatively long hood profile up front, but instead of more of a traditional trunk lid in the back, we have a sportback or a liftback design back here. That's significantly more practical than something like a Corolla, a Forte, or a Sentra, but a little bit less practical than some of those boxy vehicles that you might want to cross-shop against this. And one thing worth noting is that, like the Chevy Trax, the Envista does not have the option of all-wheel drive. This is front-wheel drive only, so I guess, again, a little bit more sedan-like, even though we do get sort of the larger wheel well motif here and a little bit more ground clearance than we find in something like a Corolla. If you didn't already know it, the Envista is 4 inches longer than the related Chevy Trax, and a lot of our Facebook followers were asking, where do those extra 4 inches go? The answer is mainly up here. Most of the 4 inches go to the differing design of the front end of the Envista, but some of the stretch goes to the back as well. It doesn't go to the cargo area, it's simply the styling of the vehicle. That's pretty common when we see hatchback versus sedan or SUV versus coupe SUV conversions. Generally speaking, to make the vehicle look right, the sedan version has to be stretched ever so slightly versus the more abrupt hatch version. The style-forward design continues out back, where we find a much slimmer profile than in the Chevy Trax hatchback and more elegantly designed taillights. Buick says on their website that these are LED taillights, but they're not full LEDs, meaning that just the parking light is an LED. The brake lights, turn signals, and backup lights, those are all incandescent. But again, keep in mind the price tag. This runs from around $24,000 on up to under $32,000, so it's a pretty narrow window. Only the top-end Avenir trim is going to get the power liftback, but honestly, I don't think that's a problem because I survived quite some time without a power trunk lid, and this is a relatively small hatch because it's a relatively small vehicle. A bunch of factors contribute to the Envista's strong value proposition, but perhaps two of the most important are where it's built and what's going on under the hood. First things first, this is built in South Korea, not in North America, and that likely contributes to its lower sticker price. That's logical because GM sells a ton of smaller vehicles in that region of the world, and it makes sense to build this in that same place. The second thing is the engine. This is not the more expensive 1.3-liter 3-cylinder turbo from the Encore and some of the other smaller GM products. This is the less expensive 1.2-liter 3-cylinder turbo. It produces 137 horsepower, 167 pound-feet of torque. And then we have the transmission. It's not a CVT, it's not a manual, it's a 6-speed automatic transmission, not an 8, 9, or a 10-speed. All of that together is the reason that the Envista gives us 30 miles per gallon, not 35 or 36 miles per gallon. So obviously there's some trade-offs here when it comes to fuel economy, the cost of the vehicle, etc. If you want fantastic fuel economy in this segment, you could get something like a Corolla hybrid, but it's going to be a lot more expensive than this. On the other hand, if you're not a fan of a continuously variable automatic transmission, this is one of a very limited number of even under $35,000 cars in North America that have a traditional automatic transmission. If you really like that feel, you want to check out this before you check out an Elantra or an Impreza or a Forte or a Sentra or even that Corolla. When I first drove the Envista late last year, I was definitely impressed by the front seat comfort, but there are a few things to keep in mind. Obviously, the base version is not going to get a power driver seat. This is the Avenir trim, so we get a power driver seat with a two-way adjustable lumbar support and a manual tilt telescopic steering column. Of course, the tilt telescopic steering column is standard in all trims. The more important thing for some folks is the seating position. Unlike something like a Kia Soul, which is right in the same price range as this, the seating position is definitely lower and more sedan-like. Again, think of this as the 21st century sedan. And that definitely is going to be a little bit different than something like a Buick Encore, which is a little bit more upright. Not a lot, but definitely a bit more. On the other hand, I get tons of headroom in here. I have maybe about 2.5, 3 inches of headroom. That is going to depend on exactly where the front seat is located. I'll show you that in a bit because the ceiling in this non-sunroof equipped model has kind of an unusual profile to it. Now, as you might expect, even in this top-end trim, the front passenger seat is a manual seat, but again, keep that price tag in mind. Jumping into the back, there is a surprising amount of room, over 80 inches of combined legroom, although keep in mind, legroom is again a calculated value from the hip point to the knee down there to the foot. So taller vehicles may have better legroom figures simply because you're sitting in a more upright seating position, and again, this is a bit more reclined. This front seat's all the way back in its tracks. Naturally, it's a little bit more reclined than the driver's seat where I would normally be sitting in, but I had a 6'5" person sitting up front. They were very comfortable on a longer trip. I still have maybe about 1.5 inches of legroom left. Moving to the middle seat position, the first thing I noticed, no air vents back here, although we do get USB charge points, a USB-C and a USB-A. That shouldn't surprise too much, of course, because even larger and more expensive vehicles like the Honda Civic, they don't get air vents in the back in North America either. That's just a cost-cutting measure. Moving over to the driver's side, I have maybe about 3.5, 4 inches of legroom left. Definitely a reasonable amount of headroom, although my head is just barely touching the ceiling back here. It's worth noting that headroom in the rear is definitely one big difference between this and the Trax. The Envista gives you more headroom in the back than the Corolla, but versus most of the compact sedan competition, this is pretty average. If I sit here in the middle again and I try and put my head back there to the headrest, you'll notice that my head is definitely touching the hinge area of the ceiling. But if you get the Trax, we get not only a higher ceiling, that hinge moves quite a bit further rearward, so you don't really hit it with your head. Helping improve cargo practicality, the rear seats fold in a 60-40 fashion rather than a 100% folding back seat, which honestly I had expected given a vehicle of this price point, and they fold completely flat with the cargo area in the back. Behind the hatch, we find more cargo capacity than we find in the average sedan competitor, but less than we find in some of the boxier hatchbacks. And the cargo area is a little bit less practical than the one we find in the Kia Soul. Obviously also versus the Chevy Trax, which again has more of a horizontal roofline and more of a vertical hatch in the back. However, I was still able to squeeze 4 24-inch roller bags back here, and that's a pretty decent score. Admittedly, I did have to remove this somewhat flimsy cargo cover here. This is not my favorite design, not just because it's kind of one of these thinner kind, but because they didn't give us anywhere to store it if you just want to take it off and put it somewhere. It doesn't really fit back here under the floor. And I'm bummed about that because it is oh so close to fitting down here. Had it been even a 1/2 inch smaller in one direction, you'd be able to put this under the load floor and then of course carry those larger cargo items. On the other hand, we have a spare tire under here, something that we don't normally find in a lot of inexpensive vehicles, especially the smaller ones, and a ton of additional storage space around that spare tire. I am surprised that Buick doesn't give us a 2-stage load floor, because if you could drop the load floor all the way down there to just on top of the spare tire, you'd actually be able to fit 22-inch roller bags like this in the upright position and it would still clear the hatch. As it is, unfortunately, with that load floor in place, you could do that if they're scooted all the way towards the seat backs, but you'd have to remove this lid. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that even though this is a top-end Avenir trim, it doesn't have all the options. So for instance, we don't have the power moonroof that is available, although we do find GM's OnStar system there. We have fold-down sun visors, but they don't slide side to side, so they're just fixed in place right like that. Here's the roof profile I said I would show you earlier. It's a little bit tricky to see, but it actually does dish up a little bit in this area, and then it comes down right about there. You notice that's a structural beam running from one B-pillar all the way across to the other, but if you're a taller person, this is probably where your head's gonna go. So if you sit closer to the steering wheel, you actually get a little bit more headroom than if you sit further away. We have fixed height shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, height adjustable headrests. There's the button over there on that side for adjusting the headrest, and of course the Avenir logo right there. Logically, the interior in this Avenir trim doesn't look as premium as the more expensive Buick Avenirs, but I think they did a good job of dressing up a relatively affordable vehicle with the contrasting piping going on here, and there are two different interior color options to choose from. This is the darker option. We have perforations in the leather upholstery in the center of the seat back and seat bottom cushion, but these seats are not ventilated, obviously, because of the price tag of the vehicle. Moving over to the front doors, we find a reasonable percentage of hard plastics, so the entire lower portion of the door, that's all made from a hard plastic, but we do get a soft touch insert right there in the middle, and they give it kind of an eccentric texture, I would say. It's not exactly the typical Naugahyde kind of faux leather texture. It's a little bit different, but we do find more of that classic sort of imitation leather texture right up there on the top of the door. That's a hard plastic as well. We get imitation metal trim running across the dashboard, as you'd imagine, and then more of that same texture going on here on the dashboard. This is a faux stitching line, so it's an injection molded dash that's been after stitched, but I think that the look is really elegant. The only element of style in here that I'm not the biggest fan of is actually the instrument cluster design, but I like the technology behind it because these two LCDs you see here are standard in every Buick trim. And these are part of the reason that the base price of this is higher than the base price in the Trax, but comparably equipped, like for like, they're almost exactly the same price. I'm not a fan of this sort of upside down triangle here. It kind of reminds me of, I don't know, Hanna-Barbera just a little bit, or maybe some of those national park signs. I think I like the look in the Cadillacs where it's a very similar design but inverted just a bit more. Now going in for a closer look, this is an approximately 11-inch touchscreen, again standard, volume and power knob right over there. In strong sunlight, it's really obvious that these screens are set into this large plastic binnacle. They get highlighted a bit more, but in this lighting it looks a little bit more contiguous. We have wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto standard. Of course, we have the native media interface there as well. Button for the traction control right there. I'm not quite sure why that's a shortcut. And then of course some of the gauges and maintenance options here. One cool touch is that if I, for instance, click on this fuel economy option here, I can say remove it from the instrument cluster or show it in the instrument cluster, and then that option is going to be transported over there to that standard LCD. Now this LCD going a little bit out of order, again it's standard, but it doesn't give us as much customization as we find in some of the larger LCDs in the General Motors lineup. Buick does give us a few different gauge views. For instance, we can have a view where we have a tachometer right there, and there's also a cleaner look, but none of them feel, you know, quite as premium as I think they could have if they had redesigned that software a little bit better. The dashboard design over here is very similar to the passenger side, and zooming out to the steering wheel, you can see that we have lots of buttons going on. So buttons for the cruise control over here on this side, also the heated steering wheel. On that side, we find buttons for the infotainment system. And if you were worried that all of GM's vehicles were going to be ditching the headlight switch, nope, we actually have a headlight switch over there. Of course, not every vehicle is on the same cycle for product development. Back here in the center console, we have the engine start-stop button, single zone automatic climate control. That's another area where costs have been cut a little bit. USB inputs for the system, you can use those if you want, or again, wireless CarPlay. And nice touch, this charging mat is capable of charging phones through some of the thicker cases out there. We have a button for the lane centering system there, an auto start-stop disable button, and a pretty traditional console shifter, so nothing wacky going on there. Although this console shifter design does mean that the cup holders end up being a little bit slimmer than I think I might have preferred, although they're split apart enough that some of those larger takeout drinks shouldn't have a problem fitting in there. We have an electric parking brake behind there, small storage area there, softly padded center armrest. It's a little bit more firmly padded than some, And then under that, we have a somewhat narrow storage area. Keep in mind, this is not the widest vehicle out there, so obviously some of these storage cubbies are going to be a little bit smaller. And then moving back to the dashboard, again, harder plastics down lower, as you'd expect. A reasonably sized bin-style glove compartment. I could not fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside. It's just a little too small. Unlike many of the affordable competition, the Envista comes standard with alloy wheels, although not these alloy wheels. 17-inch alloys are standard, and they're fitted with strangely wide tires for this segment, 225/60 R17s. That is notably wider than average, especially when we're talking about the under $25,000 options in the US. If you get the mid-level sport touring trim, we get an 18-inch alloy that's different, and we get a slightly lower profile tire. If you get this top-end Avenir trim, we get the widest tires, 245/45 R19. Definitely less cushion going on with these wheels, but importantly, strangely wide actually. So not just wider tires on the base model, it's pretty rare to find 245 with tires in this segment outside of the limited number of performance options. Most of those are actually gone now that the Veloster's dead. As we get the Envista out on the road, I would remind you of its price tag. This is one of only 12 vehicles you can buy in 2024 that is actually under $25,000 starting. And I mean $25,000 including the average sales tax in the US and the destination charge as well. This is a very rare quality. But obviously there are going to be compromises, and the first one is obviously performance. 0 to 60 in this model took 8.8 seconds. You will definitely find some quicker options out there. On the other hand, Buick does it with a stepped automatic transmission, and if you're not a fan of CVTs, this is one of a very select number of inexpensive vehicles that you could choose. Now there are going to be pros and cons. I'm just going to go ahead and stop here and then accelerate. The first one is, it's a little bit of a delay, then we get actually quite a lot of wheel spin. And actually, I'll go ahead and do that again because you'll notice something else. We get a surprising amount of growl out of this engine. If you don't believe me about the engine harmonics, let's try that again. Harmonically, a 3-cylinder engine is much closer to a V6 than a 4-cylinder is to a V8. It's just the way the harmonics interact with one another. So this has, I would say, something that is generally more pleasing as far as the engine note goes than something like a Corolla or a Civic, or even a larger Chevy with a 4-cylinder engine. But the 0 to 60 time, it's not that peppy. Now, on the other hand, 0 to 30 is surprisingly peppy because first gear is actually quite low. And thanks to that low first gear, 0 to 30 took just 2.5 seconds. That's actually only 0.2 of a second slower than something like a RAV4 hybrid, which has a high torque electric motor to help it get not only 0 to 30 pretty quickly, but 0 to 60 in just over 7 seconds. It's significantly faster than this. The difference is really between 30 and 60 miles an hour because of the stepped automatic transmission. It has to change gears, and this does not have a ton of gears to play with. It's a 6-speed, not an 8-speed or a 9 or a 10-speed like you'll find in some vehicles. That's one of those counterpoints to people not liking CVTs. CVTs are actually quite efficient, and remember, we have just 137 horsepower out of this engine. When it comes time to stop the fun, this did relatively well, 125 feet from 60 miles an hour back to 0. If you want to go a little bit shorter, you could get a Trax RS that actually is going to stop shorter because it has wider tires and actually grippier tires than the Buick that we're driving here. The mission of the Buick, even in this top-end trim, is a little bit different than in the Chevy Trax. Personally, I think I prefer the way the Trax drives out on the road versus the Envista. I noticed that this suspension, it feels really good at around 0.8. This does not have a fully independent rear suspension. It's a semi-independent in this model, and it's a non-independent suspension in the base trim. But if you push it harder than about 0.8, if you start really winding it here, especially if the road surface is not perfect, then you get a lot of hopping and bopping going on in the rear. It's just not as settled as something like a Civic or a Corolla, of course, but keep in mind the price tag. Now, on the other hand, I would say it actually feels substantially similar to a Mazda 3. I don't mean to throw Mazda under the bus, but the Mazda does not have a fully independent rear suspension, and it can have this exact same feeling. The main difference is that you have to push the 3 a lot harder to get there, and in here, you'll get there at around 80%. But again, keep in mind the price tag. Now, on the other hand, the ride quality is pretty decent, and you can thank the higher ride height for that and a little bit of extra suspension travel that we find versus a lot of the sedan competition. As far as ride quality goes, I would put this above pretty much everything else that's under $25,000 in the US. It certainly feels better out on the road than something like a Nissan Versa. And remember, direct competition for this could be seen as a Versa, a Kia Soul, a Hyundai Venue, the base versions of a Hyundai Elantra, and just one version of a Corolla. That is as low as that particular model will get, but no version of the Civic is quite as inexpensive as the base version of this. And yes, we're not driving the base version, but keep in mind that this is not that much more expensive, and a lot of those other competitors will get significantly more than this. Now at this point, some of you are probably thinking, hang on a minute, how can you give handling and ride quality an A, even an A-, when there are better handling options out there? Of course, but you're going to pay more for them, and that really is the important part. Down here at this end of the scale, even a $5,000 MSRP bump is going to be a pretty big difference in terms of affordability. So this, compared to something like a Honda Civic, absolutely the Honda Civic is going to be more engaging, it's going to be more elegant in terms of its suspension tuning, it's going to ride better, it's going to handle better, etc. But it's also going to cost you significantly more for comparable equipment. Even though we're in the top-end version of this, to comparably equip something like a Civic, you're going to be spending quite a bit more money. And performance-wise, you would actually need to upgrade into the upcoming hybrid model in order to get faster than this model. Because the base Civic, it's not especially quick. Yes, it has more power, but it also has a CVT. It's not going to feel quite as engaging for some, etc. Now back to the Buick here. In my cabin noise scoring at 50 miles an hour, I measured 72 decibels. Ooh, look, there's a deer there. Measured 72 decibels in here, which puts this about average for an inexpensive vehicle in North America. You will find that something like a Kia Soul or a Hyundai Venue, they're going to be a little bit louder, mainly because of the way the cargo compartment is designed. On the other hand, keep in mind, I am actually hearing a little bit of cargo rattling in the back because this is not actually a sedan. It is that sportback design, so there's less isolation between the trunk and the cabin. And if you don't want to hear your luggage rattling around in the back, you're going to need something like a Sentra or a Versa or something along those lines with a real trunk in the rear. Now, when it comes to fuel economy, this has been doing exceptionally well. According to the EPA, this should average 30 miles per gallon, but we've been averaging 39 miles per gallon over a few days of mixed driving. And even just on my one-way daily commute where I'm hill climbing one direction primarily, I averaged 29.7 miles per gallon, so very, very close. But when you feature in my round-trip commute where I'm going down that same slope all the way back to the office, then fuel economy really bumped up significantly, and that's all thanks to this small displacement 3-cylinder engine and the 6-speed automatic that has actually a pretty high final gear. Let's talk a little bit more about the transmission. Again, very low starting gear, so it wants to try and shift out of first gear at around 12 miles an hour or so, but if I start driving this a little bit harder and I'm say going around 37 or 40 miles an hour and I floor it, sometimes it doesn't want to go back to first because there's really not a lot of room left in first gear. And sometimes at higher speeds, the transmission may hunt a little bit to try and decide exactly which gear it wants to be in. Also, out on the open highway, especially you'll notice this in passing maneuvers, there's not a lot of power going on. So the gear ratios are very advantageous for sort of around town driving. Actually, even winding mountain road driving like this, I think the gear ratios are really well sorted. But for passing maneuvers, you will notice that it feels like it's running out of steam because 137 horsepower, that's not a lot. On the other hand, I think it's a really willing partner on a road like this. The Buick Envista is actually quite a lot of fun to drive. Sure, it's not as well polished as some of the competition, but most of those competitors are going to be significantly more expensive. And if you want something that's a little bit more fun than this, I would actually say about the proximate equal of something like a Mazda 3 hatchback, then, I would take a look at something like the Chevy Trax. It's not going to have the power of a Mazda 3, it's not going to have all-wheel drive available or a manual transmission, etc., but it is going to be an awful lot of fun. As I said at the beginning of the video, the Envista is one of only 12 vehicles you can buy new in America for 2024 and go out the door for under $25,000. For 2025, the price tag is going up a little bit, but it's still pretty close to that $25,000 mark. And importantly, the number of competitors has shrunk dramatically because we're losing at least 3 of the 12 competitors for 2025. We know that we're going to get a new Kia K4 replacing the Forte, but we don't know how much it's going to cost. We know there's going to be a new Kicks, but again, we don't know how much that is going to set you back. And Mitsubishi doesn't really seem to have a plan for the Mirage.
much. Because we don't have a complete picture for pricing and availability for the 2025 models, the prices you see on your screen are for the 2024 model year options, and that's why those models are still on this list. Now, comparisons for the Envista, it's honestly a little bit tricky, so we're going to go about this comparison a little bit differently. The first thing we should talk about is the Chevy Trax, because clearly they're very closely related. The Trax is basically the hatchback version. Now, I prefer the style of the Trax more than the style of the Envista. I think the Envista is sleek and it's modern, but I don't know if I like the front end design as far as the front end grille, and I'm not the biggest fan of the sort of horn-rimmed glasses look for the instrument cluster, the Hanna-Barbera kind of theme. It kind of reminds me of the National Park sign. I think the squarer-jawed look of the Trax is just more attractive to my eye. The Trax is also available as a less expensive vehicle. It starts at $21,495, including destination. That looks like it's a lot less expensive than the Envista, but in reality it's only about $100 less expensive when we talk about like equipment for like. If, for instance, you look at the LT trim of the Trax, that's the one where you're going to find the dual LCD cluster set up standard rather than just a single LCD like in the base Trax, it's $23,395, so only about $100 less expensive than the Buick. There is another thing to keep in mind, though. The discounts on the Buick are more aggressive than the discounts on the Trax. So if you're simply looking for a particular feature or option, you're going to find it actually for less on the Buick than on the Chevy. The downside is you're also going to find less cargo room and a little bit less rear seat headroom, just because it's not a hatchback. Although the liftback format is certainly more practical than the average sedan in this segment. Now, what is the average sedan in this segment? That's really hard to define. I would say that something like the Kia Forte or the Volkswagen Jetta, they're about as close as we can get in the US right now. The Jetta starts at $22,660. The Forte is less expensive at $21,145. If you're looking for an affordable compact sedan in the US, these are two of the most affordable options. But there are a few catches. If you're shopping for the Volkswagen, keep in mind that the 6-speed manual is what you get standard. The 8-speed automatic is optional, but you're going to pay extra for that. For some folks, that's actually going to be a benefit. And I have to admit, if I were buying a Jetta, I'd probably buy the absolute base model with the manual transmission. On the Forte, you can get a manual, but you're also going to be getting 200 horsepower in that model because you have to get the 1.6-liter turbo to get it. If you don't, you end up with a CVT and the older 2-liter naturally aspirated engine. Of course, you could also get the 1.6-liter turbo with the dual clutch, so there is a reasonable amount of variation. And I will say, if you're looking towards the top end of this pricing ladder, the Envista gets up to about $31,090, you'd actually be paying less for a manual transmission 200 horsepower Kia Forte that would definitely be a lot more fun than the Envista. It's also going to have a bigger back seat. The trunk is going to be quite practical, but you will also be looking at a vehicle that's about to get replaced because Kia has redesigned it. It's now going to be called the K4. That's going to be coming out a little bit later this year. So deals, you might find a better one here and there. It's really going to depend on exactly what you're looking for and exactly when you're shopping. Towards the end of this year, I suspect the Forte GT will probably have a few discounts on the hood, but it doesn't seem like those discounts are going to be as aggressive as what we see on the Envista. At least in my neck of the woods, the Envista currently has $3,000 of cash on the hood. Yep, $3,000 of cash, and that's for the base model and the top-end Avenir trim. So you could get an Envista for about $20,500, including destination. Plus tax, you're looking for a very affordable small sedan here. And that's why you should also consider something like a Nissan Versa or a Kicks as a competitor. We don't know pricing on the Kicks yet, but it is going to have a more practical boxy hatch in the rear. I would expect it's going to be a little bit more expensive than the Envista. Rumors point to it starting around $25,000 or $26,000, probably going on up to about $35,000 fully loaded. The Versa, on the other hand, it appears that it's not long for this world. It seems that maybe either 2024 or 2025 may be the end of the road for the Versa in North America. Currently, though, it is one of the least expensive things you can buy new. It starts at $17,820. Fully loaded, it is still less expensive than an Envista. It's going to end at around $22,300, and there are still discounts available. Bottom line for the Envista, it's an incredible value. Obviously, there are counterpoints to this. The rear suspension design is not as elegant as the average compact sedan, and you will notice that if you start driving it more aggressively or if you're out on a bumpy road, you'll notice that the rear suspension motions are not as well controlled, even in the models with the upgraded Wattslink rear suspension. It's definitely an improvement over the base model, but again, it's not as elegant as the average Honda Civic, for instance. But it is significantly less expensive. Again, currently in my neck of the woods, there's about $3,000 on the hood of the Envista, and that means it's going to be about $4,500 less expensive than a Honda Civic. That is a significant difference in terms of affordability when we're talking about base model to base model. And we get the snazzy LCDs in the Buick, and I think a nicer interior than we find in the base Civic. It's not going to be as fun to drive. It's not going to have a back seat that's as roomy. It's not going to feel as refined as the Civic, but it is going to be an awful lot more affordable. Exactly how reliable it ends up long term is a little bit of an unanswered question, but I will say that the 6-speed automatic transmission is certainly more engaging than the CVT that we find in the Civic. And keep in mind, we don't know complete pricing on the 2025 Civic as of the date that I'm recording this video. It's probably going to be coming out soon, though. Expect it to be more expensive than 2024. It hasn't changed a great deal for 2025, except that they've added the hybrid model into the lineup, but Honda has also really been ratcheting their price tag up a lot. My bad, someone off camera just told me that we do indeed have pricing for the 2025 Civic, and it's still going to be $1,350 more expensive than the Buick Envista. And of course, not as many deals on the Honda dealer lot as on the Buick lot, so certainly something to keep in mind. Finance rates and lease rates are also, generally speaking, going to be lower on the Buick. Let me know what you think about the affordable options in North America. And if you were shopping for around $25,000, what would you be looking at? Would you be willing to try something like the Buick Envista or perhaps the Chevy Trax? I have to admit, I would probably veer towards some of the least expensive Chevy Trax models, because I think as far as value goes and the deal goes, I think the Trax is a slightly better buy because, we have the actually quite attractive analog instrument cluster in the base model. We have an actually lower MSRP in that model, but you're not going to get as much of a discount on the Chevy lot. When we were doing research for this, it looks like the average Trax near me is getting about $500 on the hood. Again, the average Buick Envista is about $3,000 on the hood for the 2024 model years. So that means that the Envista is notably less expensive than the Chevy. But I do like the practicality of the larger cargo area, the more vertical hatch, and I actually think that the base analog instrument cluster in the Trax is kind of attractive. Let me know what you think about that too down there and what you'd pick if you were shopping. See all of you next week.